just shift straight into the Q&A. We've had a good number of questions come in during the webcast, so I've got those sort of lined up. I'm going to start with one that's directed at me. I'm sure all of the guys would have comments on this as well, but I don't think we can all answer everything, or else we will literally be here forever. And this is a question that I get quite frequently in these days, that I struggle with all the time, which is, if the broad markets take another lurch downwards, will that, do you think that could lead to another liquidity event that will drag everything else down, including gold? And there's been that question phrased a couple different ways from several viewers. That certainly is a potential. When we were earlier in this COVID process, I was quite concerned about that risk. As this broad market bounce has lasted so long, I am less concerned about it, because I think the more time and upside that gold develops before the markets start turning down again, the more likely it is that investors see that gold can act as a hedge in a downturn, rather than just as another source of liquidity. Another factor there, though, is how quickly downside erupts. So if the stock market's decided to redo March and fall off the cliff, a bunch of times, sure, everything's going to get sold. That's what panicked investors do. They sell everything. But more and more, I think, and I've read a lot of other analysts who think there's downside coming in the broad markets, but it's likely to be a grind. And in the case of a more steady grind downward, that, because there isn't panic, allows investors to react with a little bit more thought, and that can often involve using hedges rather than just selling everything. So yes, there's clearly that risk. I don't think that it is immense, and more importantly, the big picture context is that I think we're looking at a very strong gold market over the next few years. So if the golds get pulled down in another bottom here, that hopefully would be, I think it's likely that that would be a short-term part of this process, and there'd be lots of upside beyond. Okay, I'm going to move on. I'm going to start by asking all of you to quickly comment on, because I talked about how COVID restrictions are making exploration quite difficult for a lot of companies and in a lot of jurisdictions, and that might limit news flow in a fairly significant way going forward. Let's just go quickly through each of your jurisdictions and comment on what you understand about what exploration you will be able to do, what limitations it's going to involve, how that's going to impact your news flow going forward. So what you understand on that front. So I'll just call on you in order. So Jim, how does it look down in Brazil?
Policies are a little more lax than in North America. I think they have a different ideology around that. We're monitoring the situation very closely, particularly in the major city that I mentioned in my presentation called Fortaleza, which has over 3 million people. And that particular city has a lot of international visitors that come into it because of the international airport and the beaches and so forth. So, that area is pretty critical for our understanding, and there certainly are lots of cases there. As you get further afield to where we are, for the time being, there are a lot more limited cases, and we have only heard about a few in the area around Capital Mor. And so you've got that kind of federal policy and those guidelines, but we have to be really careful at a local level that we're not, angering the local population or putting them in danger. As it stands right now, that it's a bridge loan that's been advanced, so we have the flexibility. We're not pissing off any of our equity investors by raising money and then delaying things. As it stands, we're moving it forward. We're monitoring it closely, and so it's sort of business as usual with careful gloves.
All right, makes sense. Yeah, the Brazilian approach has definitely been somewhat different than a fair number of countries around the world, so that fits with what I understand there. We have 2 Quebec operators here, so David or Justin, I don't know who's going to jump in first, but who wants to talk about how things have been, what your understanding about your constraints and abilities in Quebec for exploration this season?
Well, I'll jump in. Unlike Ontario, Quebec mineral exploration was not included in essential businesses, And so we were basically told that we had to stop, our drilling program and, working in the core shack and that sort of thing in mid-March, which we did. And so we've also just recently heard that we're going to be able to go back and recommence the sort of working in the core shack type of activities in mid-March, or mid-May, sorry. And we would expect that, exploration is going to be able to open up shortly after that, but haven't heard specifically on resuming drilling activities. The area that we're working in is obviously, very sparsely populated compared to the large cities where most of the cases in Quebec have been. So that's fortunate. We actually had, protocols in place before the directive to stop work came down. So, I don't think it's going to affect us really that much going forward and being able to implement our plan this year.
Justin, do you have anything to add to that?
I just concur with everything David said. When we get going, we're going to start slow. We have the same understanding as David does. We're going to have a larger camp scenario where we'll be 50 to 70 people in the camp. So we're going to start slow. And we're working with Agnico and Newmont and Stornoway right now, looking at the processes that they have in place, because they're active right now. And we're just basically going to follow their lead. Because they've been in operation for 2.5, 3 weeks. And even on care and maintenance, Eleanor had, 60 people on site, even during shutdown. So they've put certain processes in place, and we're just going to follow the experts.
Gotcha. Okay. So it doesn't seem like dramatic impact. Obviously some impacts on efficiency and then some clear additional requirements, but no huge obstacles. Craig, what are you understanding about COVID impacts on exploration in your jurisdiction in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. So, of course, we were very fortunate that we'd finished our winter drill program by late February, and that allowed us to get our people out safely without any impact there. Saskatchewan's done a fantastic job of abating the pandemic there. There haven't been too many instances. Unfortunately, there are a couple in northern Saskatchewan, so that's a little bit concerning. But we think that everything's under control there. The safety of our people, our stakeholders, and the communities we operate in is paramount, of course. And so we've looked at, we do want to launch a significant drill campaign over summer. Ideally, we do we would stick probably 4 to 6 drill rigs out there to drill that deposit that we've discovered out. But we're not going to be able to do that. It'll be a scaled back program. And we've spent a heck of a lot of time over the last month working out how to do that, putting in place protocols. And we've got, we've got a 40-page dossier there that covers all of that, and particularly talking to those communities that we're near and making sure that they're comfortable with our approach. And so I think, it's manageable, and we'll be out there drilling again, probably a little bit later in summer than we otherwise would be. Okay.
That's, as I sort of outlined in my talk, what I want to know is that companies will still be able to accomplish work, have news to report and whatnot. So far, that seems like the case for everyone. Brian, what do you have to add about how things are looking in Ontario?
We weren't, I guess for the record, we weren't really ordered to stop drilling. It just became untenable for a number of reasons. Unfortunately, a few of our employees were directly affected by the virus. So it just came to the point, like, this is just not smart, this is not good, this is not healthy, and we're not doing this anymore. We suspended drilling, and we fully anticipate, we hope to be able to get back to drilling in mid to late May. We are processing core. We had to split up our crew so that we got a night shift. So there were 2 people. They got a social distance. So, you're handling the core on that basis. Fortunately, the labs are still working. And so we are getting samples to the lab, but everything just takes longer right now. But we like I said, we expect to be able to get going here next month.
Perfect. Okay. Good news on that front from everyone. I'm going to answer another question myself quickly, and then I'll start going through each of your companies one after another with questions directed for you specifically. I had one about whether central bank selling related to COVID is a big risk for the gold market. I think it's a really good question. In the depths of the March panic, that was certainly a question that was on people's minds. And there was, I would say, a decrease in buying on this part of central banks. There was not a lot of evidence of selling, but there was a decrease in buying. There was some selling. So it certainly matters. I just this morning was looking at the latest on this from the from the latest stats on this from the World Gold Council. And if you compare Q1 of 2019 and Q1 of 2020, the difference in central bank purchasing is only about 100 tons. It's actually, they're pretty much in line. So if that's at least one indication, it suggests that so far so good. Bigger picture wise, kind of relates back to my previous comment. Things were impacted in March because it was insane. It was the definition of panic. And that's why banks own gold. That's why everybody owns gold, right? Is as a store of wealth when things go crazy. So I think it wasn't surprising if central banks did some selling in that time frame, but I don't see it as a dramatic concern going forward because I don't expect there to, I think we're past the peak panic phase of this process. I think there's a lot of downside ahead, but I don't think it's the panicked form of downside. I think it's a grind down. So that's my perspective on that. I'm sure there's a range of ideas around that. Okay, Jim, I have a few questions specifically for you on ValOre, so we'll get to those. One of them is on metallurgy. Giganda was planning to do more metallurgical studies. What's ValOre's plan on that side of things? And just as a part two from that, it's completely unrelated, but anyways, as a part two, are you also going to assay for rhodium as you go forward?
So thank you, Gwen, for the two questions, or one question in two parts. So yeah, we'll be doing our own metallurgy, and we've actually engaged somebody to put together a strategy for us, which will sort of go in line with our drill program and all of our sampling. So, you know, each depository will receive testing, and we'll have a whole plan together for sampling protocol for the drill core, both the new core that we'll be producing from drilling and also historic. And to answer your second question, so that'll kind of be an ongoing thing. You know, we'll be doing that over the next year and following. As far as rhodium, we have gone back to historic sampling or sample sets to assay for rhodium. And in fact, we released the rhodium results if you go back a little while ago, and then the rhodium price went from $11,500 an ounce down to $2,500 an ounce in about 7 days. So we actually believe we caused the crash in rhodium prices with our assays. So we won't be doing any more of that. No, I'm joking. We will be doing more of that, but it is significantly more expensive. So we found that there is a correlation between the palladium, the platinum, and the rhodium numbers. So I think we'll probably be selective, but we'll definitely be looking at that. And as we move forward, we'll be doing it. But when we're out kind of like running and gunning, trying to identify new deposits and new targets, we'll probably just sample for palladium and platinum rather than getting the full suite, which would include rhodium.
Okay.
At this stage.
Okay. One other specific question for you has to do with permitting. The permitting process that you completed recently for Pedra Branca took longer than you anticipated. Can you expand a bit on why, and do you expect such issues to be a constant sort of going forward for the project, or what's your outlook on the timelines for permitting?
I would characterize it as growing pains to start with, because it really is just comes down to something they call vegetation suppression in Brazil. So one of the things you don't want to be doing is when you're drilling, you don't want to be taking down trees of a certain diameter. That's the main thing, and I think that comes as a sort of an offshoot of doing a lot of work in the Amazon rainforest and where there's lots of larger trees. So in an area that we are like that, as I showed you in that picture, you ain't finding lots of big trees. It is very dry, and there aren't a lot of trees. And so what we actually wanted to do in phase 1 is completely eliminate any element of vegetation suppression. So it was completely obvious to any regulator that we'd avoided all of those hindrances. So we used existing access roads, farmers fields, anything we could. It took us a little bit longer to do that. So it'll be a really problem-free drilling process. And I think going forward, we can start on phase 1 and many of the targets on phase 2, if not all of them. And as we go on to further phases, we can start that permitting process well in advance if there are trees we have to avoid or vegetation suppression that becomes an issue. So the answer is no. The answer is no. It was, I can't remember what the hell you asked, but yes. But yes and no.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Jim. I'm going to move along. We'll end up circling back with some group questions after. David, we have some Genesis questions here. Genesis has completed 8 holes. Some were certainly submitted before COVID. When do you expect those results to come out? And then the same person also was inquiring about when do you anticipate being, we kind of just touched on this a moment ago, but this person's keen to see you start testing the east zone. So maybe what other work needs to be done there, and when do you think you'll be able to start getting holes into the east zone?
Sure. Yeah, we got a few of the holes that we drilled. We drilled, as I said, 8 holes, just over 2,000 meters out of the plan, 2,500 to 3,000 meters, and approximately half of that was sampled and sent off to the lab. So we would expect to, be getting that, pretty soon. And as I said, we now know that we can get back on the ground and finish up the sampling and get the rest of the core sent off to the lab in mid-May. So, I would expect we would have all the results back by the end of May, early June at the latest. In terms of other targets and drilling, we're currently working on prioritizing targets outside of the main zone. I think we'll probably wait to get the results from this effort to try to better define the high-grade areas within the main zone and look for expansion potential before we determine whether we need to do more on that. But we are prioritizing a number of targets outside of the main zone, and including around the east zone. And as I also said, that's one of the areas that there does seem to be potential from the TIL survey that there might be an extension off to the east of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Someone was clearly looking back at Genesis's, that's a hard one to say, share price chart, and noticed the turnaround on a dime is the comment made here that happened, at the beginning of the year or late last year. Late last year, the company did not have much money in the bank, so things really changed. Can you take us through what happened there? Because I think maybe it might sort of also be a bit of an instructive story in how these stocks can change.
Yeah, well, I didn't really mention this, but my involvement with Genesis, had been sort of being talked about over the summer and fall last year, but I didn't actually join the company until December, beginning of December. But that was all sort of done in conjunction with consolidation of the shares. So there was a consolidation of the outstanding shares and a concurrent financing on the back of that. So we raised a bit over $4 million, and we've brought in a new team. We've got targets generated with the work that's been done in 2019 and now on into 2020, and we've obviously got some new shareholders in the company. So it was all sort of a combination of bringing in some new people, generating some new target ideas and new investors, and obviously the company is well funded now.
Unmuted.
Yeah, you're muted.
There we go. I'm unmuted now. It was telling me that no one could hear me. Inappropriate. Everyone needs to be able to hear me all the time. Okay, I'm going to move on. Like I say, I will circle back with a few questions here for everyone. But Craig, there's been lots going on in the uranium space. One of the things that's happened that we did not touch on was the Nuclear Fuel Working Group report. So the question is just straight up, how do you think the Nuclear Fuel Working Group report will impact uranium prices?
Yeah, good question. Not as much as these supply cutbacks will. You know, that's the main game in town, of course, always has. It's a supply side story. But you know, that nuclear fuel working group, a little bit of a boondoggle to some extent. I think, you know, people are looking at that for some sort of panacea. Certainly positive for a couple of US producers that, you know, what they've decided is that they'll create a strategic stockpile sourced from a couple of producers. But that stockpile, you know, they're talking about 10 million pounds, which is really only 5% of annual supply. So, you know, it's going to have a fairly modest impact. To my mind, the most significant thing to come out of that, and of course the US is the biggest consumer of nuclear fuel, you know, 40% of supply goes to the US. The biggest impact is that they have a right, or a right to veto production coming in from the former Soviet, from Russia or China, and of course quite a bit of fuel's processed and supplied into the US from Russian mills and facilities. And so, you know, if that were ever to be enacted, it would be a tremendous positive for Canadian producers and Australian producers, you know, producers in friendly jurisdictions. So, you know, I think that's the most significant thing there that's happened. And just to go back to your other question about what, you know, impacts of COVID-19, well, that's been, of course, the biggest impact on the uranium market. And, you know, we hear that those big producers like Cameco and Kazatomprom, whilst they've taken their production offline because of this pandemic, they're only going to bring production back on stream on a commercial basis if they can get a reasonable price for the uranium going forward. So, you know, a couple of positive things there out of a bad situation.
Absolutely. Let's focus in on your project specifically. I think one point that I'd like to ask a question on is the western property boundary. And so I think there's maybe sort of two ways to look at that. Clearly, the hurricane zone that you're delineating at this point gets up pretty close to it. So yeah, what do you think about that? Who's on the other side? What potential impact does that have on the discovery that you're making?
Yeah, sure. Look, you know, we're taking the view that what we've got there at Hurricane will, you know, is a significant high-grade deposit in its own right. And I think, you know, based on what we're seeing there, still got a lot of work to do. And, you know, there's a few forward-looking statements coming up from me here. But I think, you know, we've got a project that will one day be a mine. It's looking like that. It's an incredibly high-grade and serious deposit. Certainly, though, it continues on to the west of us. You know, we've got a high-grade hit right up against the property boundary. We wanted to test that. That property over there is part of the massive Dawn Lake joint venture, which is owned by Cameco and Orano. Certainly, we've tried to get in there in the past. I think, you know, Cameco and Orano are both significant shareholders of ours and important shareholders. You know, I don't know. We make no bones about the fact that it does continue on into that ground, and we've certainly talked to those guys, those companies about it. We'd love to be able to get a deal. I'd love to come back to you in the next couple of months and say we're doing something there. But at the very least, we're trying to encourage Cameco as the operator to get in and test what's a long strike. And I think, you know, the results of our winter program have piqued their interest, and I think that they'll have drill rigs out there very, very soon and seeing what they've got, because you know, Hurricane's significant, but if it extends a significant distance onto that ground, well, the question becomes, does it become a cigar lake or some sort of, you know, massive deposit like that? Well, then, you know, that changes the game for us completely again.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm sure the simple answer is that it would be great to own everything, but there's pros and cons to Cameco, Orano having the other side of it and their capacity to explore. And yes, if they do start exploring that could have good upside for ISO on its own. So interesting. That'll be an interesting story to watch. I think one last question I want to ask you on the uranium space. This is something that you've talked about in other presentations, but if investors who don't have exposure to uranium are interested in establishing that part of their portfolio, other than obviously buying IsoEnergy? Sort of how do you approach it? I mean, this is a space that used to have hundreds of companies and now has not very many. So like, yeah, what if you had to give a quick primer on how to establish some uranium exposure before this thing goes crazy, what would you say?
Yeah, well, it's pretty simple to get set. The combined market cap of our sector today is about $10 billion. That's everything, including ETFs. Those holding companies like UPC, Yellowcake in London, $10 billion. Back in 2010, the combined market cap of the sector was over $100 billion. So the beta potential alone in the sector is a 10-bagger. As things return to normal trading, which we think we'll see pretty soon. And then, if you want to get set in the sector, back in 2010, bit of a challenge. You had to filter through 500 odd companies to know who's worth investing in. It's been Darwinian, a war of attrition over the last 7 or 8 years, and we've seen those numbers of active companies and companies that you would consider investing in to certainly reduce to less than 50 companies. So, we take the view that you could build a basket, a portfolio of those sorts of companies in your investment basket there. Or, you can focus on the guys that are active, that have got a new high-grade discovery like IsoEnergy. There's only one of us at the moment. Or, great companies with true tier 1 assets like NextGen. And, of course, you'd want to have a mix of sort of producers in there as well, I think.
Okay. We're going to need to move along here because the next session actually starts in only 20 minutes and people might need a moment to take a break. So let me move on to Justin here. Justin, I think one aspect that I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about is the permitting side. Advanced assets with big resources that are moving towards development in the gold space are not that common. You talked a lot about your infrastructure advantages. What is the permitting setup and how would that impact move towards production for Troilus?
Yeah, good question. If it was a longer presentation, you'd see me have a slide, which is the last 12 mines in Quebec that have attempted to be permitted. And what you'll see is a variance between 12 and 36 months. First of all, every mine that has applied to be permitted in Quebec has been permitted, right? And the variance in time is a function of management, changing scope, economics of the commodity or the project, or availability of capital. So from that perspective, you couldn't be in a better place to permit a mine. Jump forward, we're a brownfield site. What the amendment means is once we are done our pre-feasibility, we'll have to put a project description forward. That project description is going to deal with everything that the mine needs to be permitted with, including the EIA, new baseline work, all those things which are almost complete with us. We're guiding to 6 to 12 months to permit once we put in our project description. That's as an amendment. And that guidance is coming from the MERN to us, not us to the market. So the government has 15 years of data. We've been continually inspected since the mine is shut down. And as such, we have a lot of confidence because this is a brownfields disturbed site. We are not reinventing the wheel here at all, and we have an active mining lease.
Gotcha. That sounds good. Yeah, that was how I understood things. I know you don't have official numbers on this to the market because obviously your PEA is still pending, but someone was wondering about strip and what kind of expectations you have for strip ratio given the shape of the mineralization.
Good question, and obviously it depends on the cutoff grade. And again, in our longer presentation on our website, we run through the pits at a 0.3, a 0.6, and a 0.9 cutoff. At a 0.3 cutoff, which in a $1,700 gold environment, we certainly take it. You're looking at about less than a 3-to-1 strip right now on the J zone. When you get to Z87 South, coming off the edge of the pit, it's zero strip. You have to clear 2 meters of till, and you're on it. And the Southwest to be determined, but we're tracing all those zones to surface. As such, I think you're going to see pretty low strip there. And the fact that we're seeing about 20% higher grade in the Southwest, and we're seeing these zones extend to surface, probably is going to have an influence on how we sequence this mine. But in general, fairly low strip.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, Brian, I'm going to move on to you. What would you think of as success? I mean, you have results pending, and I think there's a fair bit of curiosity about those results. What would you think of as success from those holes? I know the market, got interested when you said that you'd intersected the vein in quite a few of those holes. What are you looking to see? I mean, the point of this program was to delineate higher grade shoots within this zone. So anyways, what would you think of as success from these results?
Well, we did. Yes, I can see. We did hit the vein in most of the holes, and the assays are pending. A majority of them are still pending. I think hitting it and knowing it's there is a very positive thing. The step out. The step out holes are very, very important because that'll demonstrate that this thing is bigger than what was previously thought, but also drilling through the number one and drilling deeper and tagging into mineralized zones at depth is I think will be the real catalyst for keeping things going forward. The historic estimate is, I guess it's not huge, and but it's a manifestation of the system. And but I think the real joy will be some of the deeper holes in and around the cyanide, in and around the heart of the system. So I think we'll, once we get all our numbers and everything in, I think we're well on our way.
And you expect that sometime in the next month? Do you want to have any more clarity on that, or is that just what you're going to leave at?
The end of May, investors have been incredibly patient with us, and we've looked at this long and hard, and we've had these roadblocks and these issues, but definitely, you're hearing it here. By the end of May, we're going to have the numbers will definitely be out. I'm hoping sooner, and that we can actually start drilling again here very soon as well by mid-May.
Fantastic. Well, team, I think we have to wrap it up there because we need to give people at least a 15-minute break, a time to go to the washroom and do their thing before the next session starts with Joe Mazumdar and his crew of companies. So from me, and certainly from the gentlemen on the panel, I'd certainly like to thank everyone for listening, for being interested, for sending in questions. If you have any other questions for any of these guys or for me, certainly contact the Metals Investor Forum. They would be happy to pass along any questions to us, and we'd be happy to answer them. So thanks everyone for your time, and stay tuned for Joe's session with another good group of companies starting here shortly.